They call it the Cathedral of Basketball, but if you've ever actually stood on the floor of the Palestra during a doubleheader, you know it's less about prayer and more about penance. I'm Roger Harrison, and today we're talking about the Big Five on the Sports Deep Dive podcast.
Hilarious history and bizarre plays. We've got the stories from the glory days. Don't just watch the scoreboard, know the game. Be the smartest person in the frame. Sports Deep Dive, give them something more. Sports Deep Dive, give them something more.
In most cities, a rivalry means one game a year against a school 2 states over. But in Philadelphia, it's a civil war that happens in a 5-mile radius. In 1955, 5 schools, Temple, Villanova, St. Joe's, LaSalle, and Penn, did something that should have worked. They agreed to split the gate, share the spotlight, and beat the living hell out of each other once a year for the rights to the city. This wasn't about sparkling new arenas or giant jumbotrons. This was about the rollouts, those hand-painted banners that could make a grown coach blush. It was about the streamers flying through the air after the first basket, a rainbow of crepe paper that would stop the game cold while the janitors scrambled with brooms. It was a time when the Big Five coaches wouldn't dare scout for an outsider against one of their own. Because at the end of the day, you might hate the Hawk or the Wildcat on a Tuesday night, but you were all part of the same lineage. The Big Five was a brainchild of Jerry Ford, the athletic director at the University of Pennsylvania. In the early 1950s, Penn had a problem. They owned the Palestra, a magnificent but aging arena that was expensive to maintain. At the same time, Philadelphia's college basketball scene was fragmented. Teams played in various gyms or at the old convention hall, but there was no centralized city series. Ford's pitch was simple and revolutionary. Bring the 5 major programs, Penn, LaSalle, St. Joe's, Temple, and Villanova, together under one roof. Create a round-robin schedule where everyone played everyone once. Share the gate. After Penn was reimbursed for the Palestra's upkeep, the 5 schools split the remaining profits equally. While the Palestra was one of the world's largest when it opened in 1927, originally seating about 10,000, by the mid-1950s, other schools had built much bigger cathedrals. For example, Hinkle Fieldhouse in Indianapolis sat at 15,000 at the time, and Williams Arena at the University of Minnesota sat over 14,000. When the Palestra opened in 1927, it was marketed as having 10,000 seats. However, that was based on the standard at the time, 18-inch bleacher spaces and people standing in the aisles and end zones. It was essentially fire hazard math. By the time the Big Five era began in 1955, a few things had changed that shrunk the official capacity while technically improving the facility. To accommodate the massive doubleheaders Jerry Ford was planning, they had to formalize the seating. This meant creating actual aisles, wider seating spaces, and following stricter fire codes that didn't exist in the 20s. As the Big Five grew, they needed more room for radio broadcasters, the Big Five stat crews, and the rollout banners. They sacrificed standing room and tight corner bleachers to make room for infrastructure of a modern city series. When they talk about the 1955 expansion, they often referring to the utility of the building, upgrading the locker rooms, the lighting, and the scoreboard to handle 2 games in one night. So while the official number dropped to 9,100 seats, the Big Five energy actually made it feel like there were 15,000 people in the Palestra. All right, so let's get to the official birth of the Big Five. On November 23rd, 1954, Penn President Dr. Gaylord Harnwell officially announced the formation of the Big Five at Houston Hall. While the agreement was signed in 54, the actual games didn't tip off until the 55-56 season. The name Big Five wasn't actually part of the formal agreement. It was coined by Herb Good, a sports writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it stuck so well that the schools eventually adopted it officially. The very first Big Five game wasn't a triple overtime thriller. It was a holy war preview. St. Joseph's defeated Villanova 83-70 in front of a relatively small crowd of about 2,600 fans. At the time, nobody knew that they were witnessing the start of a 70-year tradition. Now, don't let the Holy War nickname fool you. When Villanova and St. Joe's met at the Palestra, it was anything but peaceful. You had the Jesuits from City Avenue, St. Joe's, taking on the Augustinians from the main line. That would be Villanova. They shared the same faith, but for 40 minutes on a Tuesday night, the only thing they wanted to share was a hard foul and a win. It's kind of rivalry where even the guys in the Roman collars were probably checking the spreads. As a former St. Joe's star, Jack McKinney told Bill Line of the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1995, quote, "At the time it was of no super importance. The importance has grown as the years have passed," end quote. Imagine you're a coach in the 1960s. You're fighting for your life in a packed Palestra on a Tuesday, and by Friday, a team from the Midwest calls you up. They want to know the weaknesses of the Temple Owls or the St. Joe's Hawks. In any other city, you'd give up the scouting report in a heartbeat just to see your rival lose. But not in Philadelphia. The Big Five coaches, legends like Jack Ramsay, Harry Litwack, and Duty Moore, had an unwritten rule, the Pact of Silence. They agreed that they would never, under any circumstances, provide scouting information or game film secrets to an out-of-town team playing against another Big Five school. They were rivals from December to February, but they were a brotherhood against the world. If you wanted to beat a Philly team, you had to figure it out for yourself because no one in the city was going to help you. They created a Philadelphia versus everyone mentality that made the Big Five a terrifying gauntlet for any outsider brave enough to step into the Palestra. Now, if you want to talk legendary, you have to talk about 1969. LaSalle was ranked number 2 in the country, led by Kevin Durrett, but they were banned from the postseason due to NCAA violations. Their postseason became the Big Five. They went 4-0 in the city, treated every Palestra game like a national championship, and provided that in Philly, you don't need a tournament bracket to be a king. If the 60s were the golden age, the 80s were the powerhouse era. Now, this was the decade where the Big Five stopped being a local secret and started dictating the national conversation. Rolly Mass, at Villanova, taking the Wildcats into the brand new Big East and eventually to that legendary 1985 national championship. But here's the thing. In Philadelphia, a national title doesn't give you a pass. In 1985, the same year they stunned Georgetown to win it all, Villanova still had to fight for their lives in the city. They went 4-0 in the Big Five that year, including a 47-44 absolute grind out against St. Joe's of the Spectrum. It proved that even on top of the world, you were only as good as your last game at 33rd and Spruce. There was also 1988. If you want to talk about the greatest game in Big Five history, many will point to February 10th at McGogle Hall. You had number 1 ranked Temple versus number 20 ranked Villanova. It was John Chaney versus Roland Massimino. It was a game so intense that Chaney later said that he and Raleigh could have just stood on Broad Street and ate peanuts because the players were the ones orchestrating the war. Temple won that night, 98-86, behind 31 points from freshman Mark Macon. It was the night North Broad Street felt like the center of the basketball universe. And then there's the 2004 St. Joe's run. Jameer Nelson and Delonte West, 2 names that still echo in the rafters, They went undefeated in the regular season, swept the Big Five, and took the Hawk Will Never Die mantra all the way to the Elite Eight. That season reminded the entire country that a small gym on City Avenue could still produce the best backcourt in the nation. Now, if the coaches' pack was the soul of the Big Five, Tom Gula was a face. Before he was a Philadelphia Warrior, before he was an NBA champion, Tom Gula was an explorer at LaSalle. To this day, Gula remains the only player in NCAA history to record over 2,000 points and 2,000 rebounds. Think about that. We see great players every year, but nobody's ever dominated both ends of the floor with those kind of stats. He was a 6'6" point forward before the term even existed. When the Big Five officially tipped off in 1955, Gula had just finished leading LaSalle to a national championship and a runner-up finish. He was the bridge between the college game and the pros, a local kid who proved that if you could make it at 33rd and Spruce, you could make it anywhere. He didn't just play for LaSalle, he was Philadelphia basketball. Gula was so synonymous with the city that eventually served as the Philadelphia city controller and ran for mayor. He wasn't just a sports hero, he was a civic institution. When Temple, St. Joe's, and eventually LaSalle were in the A-10, it created a unique tension for the Big Five. In a normal year, a Big Five game was a non-conference bragging rights battle, but once they were in the same league, they often played twice, home and away. The Big had to make a logistics ruling. Only the first meeting of the season counted toward the Big Five standings. So starting in 1982, for the next 31 years, Temple and St. Joe's weren't just city rivals, they were conference enemies. When LaSalle joined them in 95, the Atlantic 10 started to feel more like 33rd and Spruce than a national conference. It meant more games, higher stakes, and more chances for Goon Gate-style drama. It was the era where you didn't just play for the city, you played for your life in the standings. Now you might think that when Temple packed their bags for the American Athletic Conference in 2013, the Big Five finally got its breathing room back. No more Temple versus St. Joe's as a conference game, right? Wrong. Even with Temple gone, the conference problem just moved down the road. You still had LaSalle and St. Joe's locked in the Atlantic 10 together, meaning their Big Five matchup was still pulling double duty. And then there was Villanova. As the new Big East established itself as a national powerhouse, the gap between the haves and the have-nots in the city started to widen. The schedule became a battlefield of math. Villanova's head coach, Kevin Willard, eventually put it bluntly. In a world of 20-game conference schedules and multi-million-dollar rosters, playing a meaningless non-conference game against a local rival wasn't just about pride anymore. It was a financial risk. If you played an away game at LaSalle and lost, it didn't just hurt your feelings, it nuked your NCAA tournament resume. So even without Temple and St. Joe sharing a league, the Big Five remained trapped in a double whammy. The schools were caught between 1955 tradition of playing for the city and the 2013 reality of playing for the bracket. It was a tug of war that nearly snapped the rope. But here's the thing, the reason the rope was worth fighting for in the first place, the reason these conference battles felt so life or death is because of the sheer gravity Philadelphia basketball has always exerted on the national stage. You see, the Big Five didn't just exist in a vacuum of college schedules and Atlantic 10 standings. It was actually the life support system for professional basketball in this city. To understand why the double whammy mattered so much, you have to realize that without the heat generated by these five schools at the Palestra, the NBA might have abandoned Philadelphia altogether after the Warriors left. Now, you might be wondering where the Sixers were while the Big Five was finding its feet in 1955. Truth is, the 76ers were still 300 miles north playing as the Syracuse Nationals. But Philadelphia wasn't exactly ready to round. The city already had the Philadelphia Warriors, a powerhouse team that would go on to win the NBA title that very same season. But here's the thing, the Warriors were successful because they were built on the back of the Big Five's culture. They featured legends like Paul Azrin, a Villanova standout, and Tom Gula, the pride of LaSalle. When the Warriors eventually packed up for San Francisco in 1962, it left a massive basketball-shaped hole in the city's heart. But the NBA didn't panic. They saw the Palestra rocking every single week for Big Five doubleheaders. They saw 9,000 fans screaming for kids from North Foley in the main line. That college energy is exactly what convinced the league to bring the Syracuse Nationals down to Philly and rebrand them as the 76ers in 1963. The Sixers just didn't land in sports town. They landed in a city that had been kept basketball mad by the Big Five. Professional hoops in Philadelphia owes its very survival to those five schools at 33rd and Spruce that never let the lights go out. For nearly 70 years, the Big Five was a closed shop. Drexel was always the sixth man, the school right next door to Penn that played Division I hoops wasn't invited to the party. But in 2023, the unthinkable happened. The Big Five officially welcomed Drexel University as a full member. It wasn't just a courtesy, it was a necessity to keep the tradition alive in the era of the Big Five Classic. By letting the Dragons in, the series shifted to a pod format and a triple header at the Wells Fargo Center. Some fans called it hearsay. Others called it survival. But when Drexel stepped onto the court for the first time, for its official first Big Five game, it felt like a decades-old neighborhood grudge had finally been settled. The Big Five became the Big Six, and the City Series found a way to breathe in a new century. The Drexel Dragons play in the Coastal Athletic Association, so they do not play in the Atlantic 10. So, whether it's five schools or six, whether it's at the Palestra or the Wells Fargo Center, the heart of the series remains the same. It's about the streamers, the rollouts, and the fact that for one night a year, your neighbor is your worst enemy. Thanks for joining me on this trip through the cathedral. I'm Rogers Harrison, and remember, in Philadelphia, the hawk never dies, and the streamers never stop flying. See you next time on the Sports Deep Dive podcast.